A decorated veteran enters a quiet beachside café only to face unexpected judgment and rejection from a suspicious waitress. But when a 911 call brings an officer with a surprising connection to the veteran, everything changes. Will the truth about his past shatter assumptions and inspire a powerful lesson, or will prejudice win the day? Stay tuned to see this incredible story of redemption, respect, and the strength of community unfold. Robert's boots thudded against the weathered wooden planks of the boardwalk. The sound reminded him of something he couldn't quite place. Marching orders, perhaps, or the echo of a distant past that he tried daily to suppress. Dressed in faded jeans and a jacket that had seen better days, he walked with purpose, but carried the weight of 1,000 moments in his mind. Each step forward wasn't just movement. It was resistance against the pull of darker memories that threatened to drag him back. Today wasn't about memories, though. Today was about finding peace, or at least trying to. Robert had a ritual. Pick a quiet spot in town, sit down with a cup of coffee, and let the sound of the ocean fill the spaces in his mind that words or therapy couldn't quite reach. The café, a small, family-run spot on the edge of the boardwalk, looked promising. Its charm came from its simplicity. A few outdoor tables, a chalkboard menu listing the specials of the day, and the gentle hum of patrons' conversations blending with the ocean breeze. As he entered, the gentle chime of the bell above the door momentarily silenced the soft murmur of voices. Patrons glanced up briefly, their curiosity flickering away almost as quickly as it appeared. Robert didn't mind. He wasn't looking for attention. He was looking for quiet. At the counter stood Denise, a waitress in her early 40s with a crisp apron tied around her waist. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a bun that somehow seemed more rigid than necessary. Denise had worked in the cafe for years, and in her eyes she'd seen all sorts of customers. Some were pleasant, others were more trouble than they were worth. In Robert, she thought she saw trouble. He approached the counter with a small nod, his voice soft but steady. "Just a black coffee, please." Denise's eyes scanned him quickly, his unshaven face, his frayed jacket, the hint of fatigue in his eyes. Her lips tightened. I don't think we can serve you today," she said abruptly, her voice cool but firm. Robert blinked, confusion clouding his expression. "Excuse me?" "Look, we've had issues before," she said, gesturing vaguely, as though the mere suggestion of issues was enough to justify her refusal. "I don't want any trouble." Robert stood silently for a moment, the weight of her judgment settling on him like another invisible burden. "I'm not here for trouble. Just a coffee." Denise hesitated, her discomfort visible. "I'm sorry, I can't." Robert nodded once, his expression unreadable, then turned and left the counter without another word. Denise watched Robert walk away from the counter, her lips pursed tightly. Something about him unsettled her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, not threatening, but certainly out of place in her neatly ordered cafe world. The truth was, Denise wasn't afraid of trouble itself. She was afraid of not being in control. And people like Robert, with their unreadable faces and silent struggles, made her feel like she wasn't. "Who was that?" asked Amy, the college-age barista working the espresso machine. She glanced at Robert as he took a seat near the window, his posture relaxed but his eyes distant. "Das on, who doesn't belong here," Denise muttered under her breath, leaning closer to Amy as if her words might somehow explain themselves. "I've seen his type before." Amy frowned. "His type? You know what I mean," Denise said, quickly waving her hand dismissively. "Drifters, veterans who don't adjust." Amy's frown deepened. "You mean someone who served our country?" Denise shot her a sharp look. "Don't twist my words. I'm just saying we have to be cautious. This is a business, not a charity." Her voice lowered as she glanced over at Robert again. He was sitting quietly, staring out at the ocean through the cafe's salt-streaked windows. He didn't seem to notice, or care, that several patrons were now giving him sideways glances, their curiosity laced with Denise's unspoken suspicion. Robert reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, battered notebook. Flipping it open, he began to sketch the habit he had picked up during long deployments overseas. Drawing was his way of making sense of the chaos in his mind. Today, he sketched the waves outside, the crest of the water rolling onto the beach. Amy watched him for a moment, then turned back to Denise. "He's just sitting there, not bothering anyone." "That's how it starts," Denise muttered, her hand tightening on a cloth she was using to wipe the counter. "I'm not going to wait for him to cause a scene." Amy sighed, shaking her head. "You don't even know him." Denise didn't respond, but her eyes never left Robert. She thought she was being vigilant, protecting her space, but the truth was she was projecting her own fears. Fears of the unknown, fears of the stories she had read in the news about troubled veterans. In her mind, it was easier to assume the worst than to confront her own bias. She set the cloth down and picked up the cafe phone, her fingers hesitating for only a moment before she dialed. "Yes, this is Denise at Shoreline Cafe. There's someone here. I think you should check on." The soft hum of the cafe was interrupted by the sharp clink of Denise setting the phone down. She glanced around nervously, half hoping no one had overheard her call. Amy looked at her incredulously from behind the espresso machine, clearly disapproving but not willing to challenge her boss further. Meanwhile, Robert sat at the corner table by the window, his attention wholly focused on the sketchbook in his hands. The rhythmic motion of his pencil created faint sounds of graphite scratching against paper, a calming act that contrasted starkly with the tension brewing behind the counter. Denise, feeling the weight of her decision, moved to the kitchen under the pretense of checking on supplies. She didn't want to admit it, but part of her felt unsettled. By the man, by Amy's reaction, and by her own hastiness. From the kitchen doorway, she could see Robert still sitting there, completely absorbed in his sketch. He didn't appear dangerous, but that only made her discomfort grow. At the same time, the cafe's other patrons began to notice the shift in the atmosphere. A middle-aged woman sitting 2 tables over leaned in to whisper to her companion. "Do you think he's okay?" she asked, nodding subtly in Robert's direction. "I don't know," her friend replied, her voice low. "He doesn't seem to be doing anything, just drawing." "Maybe Denise knows something we don't," the first woman murmured, her tone suggesting she was seeking reassurance rather than offering an opinion. At Robert's table, his sketch began to take form. A depiction of the ocean waves crashing against the pier, capturing both the chaos and serenity of the scene. He paused occasionally to adjust the shadows or add texture to the water, completely unaware of the unease swirling around him. The front door of the cafe opened with a faint chime, and a young couple entered, pausing momentarily to take in the scene. They glanced at Robert, then at Denise peeking out from the kitchen. Sensing the tension, they decided on takeout instead of dining in. Amy, now steaming milk for another order, muttered to herself, "This is ridiculous." She wiped her hands on her apron and approached Denise, her voice low but firm. "Are you really calling the police because someone looks a little rough around the edges?" "He's just drawing, Denise. What's he going to do, sketch us to death?" Denise snapped, her voice just above a whisper. "I'm being cautious, Amy. You never know what someone like that might do. We've got a responsibility to keep things safe here." Amy opened her mouth to respond, but a faint noise from outside caught both their attention, the sound of approaching sirens. Denise's breath hitched slightly. She hadn't expected the response to be so quick. Robert, finally glancing up from his sketch, caught the distant wail of the sirens too. His brow furrowed as he looked out the window. He couldn't imagine the police had anything to do with him, but the sound brought back a flood of memories. Situations when sirens meant something far worse than a disturbance at a cafe. He took a deep breath, trying to ground himself. As the sirens grew louder, the mood in the cafe shifted again, unease rippling through the patrons. Denise smoothed her apron and stepped toward the door, her posture stiff as if bracing herself. Amy stayed behind the counter, her disapproval evident in the tight line of her lips. The squad car pulled up just outside, its lights flashing but the siren now silent. A single officer stepped out, adjusting his belt before heading toward the cafe door. Denise exhaled sharply, steeling herself. Whatever was about to happen, she felt confident she'd done the right thing. But as the door opened and the officer walked in, the last thing Denise expected was the look of recognition that flashed across his face when he saw Robert. The officer stepped into the café, his presence immediately shifting the energy in the room. His uniform was crisp, his posture authoritative but not imposing. His name badge read Officer Daniels, and his gaze swept the space until it landed on Robert. For a moment, his professional demeanor cracked, replaced by visible surprise and recognition. "Robert," Daniels said, his voice tinged with disbelief. Robert glanced up, momentarily caught off guard. Recognition flickered across his face, softening his otherwise guarded expression. "Daniels," he replied, his voice even, but with a hint of familiarity. Denise, standing stiffly by the counter, felt her stomach drop. This was not how she imagined things unfolding. She hadn't expected the officer to know the man she'd called about. She tried to regain control of the situation, stepping forward. "Officer," Denise began, her voice faltering slightly, "thank you for coming. I called because, well, I thought it was better to be safe. He came in, I wasn't sure." Daniels turned his attention to Denise, his brow furrowing. "You weren't sure about what?" Denise stammered, her confidence wavering under his steady gaze. "I mean, he just seemed out of place. I didn't want to risk anything happening. You know how things are these days." Daniels let out a slow breath, his frustration evident. "You called because someone looked out of place?" Before Denise could respond, Robert interjected, his voice calm but firm. "It's fine, Daniels. She's just doing what she thought was right." Daniels looked back at Robert, shaking his head. "No, it's not fine. This isn't right." He turned to Denise again, his tone measured but pointed. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" Denise blinked, caught off guard. "No, he—" Daniels cut her off, his voice rising slightly. "This man is Robert Hayes. He's a decorated Marine who served multiple tours overseas. I know because I served with him." The café fell silent. Patrons who had been quietly watching now leaned in, their curiosity piqued. Even Amy, standing behind the counter, froze, her eyes wide. Denise felt a flush creep up her neck. I didn't know," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. Daniel stepped closer to Robert, his expression softening. "I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for him. He saved my life in Kandahar. And now he can't even get a cup of coffee without someone making assumptions?" Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat, not wanting the attention. "Daniels, it's okay, really." "No," Daniel said firmly, turning back to Denise. "It's not okay. People like him deserve our respect, not our judgment." Denise's face turned pale, the full weight of her actions sinking in. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the espresso machine and the distant crash of waves outside. Daniels placed a hand on Robert's shoulder. "Come on, let's get out of here," he said, his voice gentler now. Robert stood slowly, picking up his sketchbook and tucking it under his arm. He gave Denise a small nod, not of forgiveness, but of acknowledgment, before following Daniels to the door. As the two men stepped outside, the chatter in the café slowly resumed, but Denise remained rooted in place, her thoughts swirling. She had made a mistake, a big one, and it was one she wouldn't soon forget. Denise stood frozen by the counter, her hands gripping the edge as if it could anchor her against the tide of emotions washing over her. The murmurs in the café swirled around her like a storm, fragments of conversation cutting through the air. "Did you hear what the officer said? He saved his life. I had no idea. He seemed so quiet." "Oh, but poor man, he didn't deserve that." Denise clenched her jaw, trying to block out the voices. She felt exposed, like everyone in the room could see the guilt twisting inside her. For years she had prided herself on being vigilant, on protecting her café and its patrons. But today her actions had been based on nothing but fear, and it had backfired spectacularly. Amy approached cautiously, her arms folded. "Denise," she began softly, "I think you owe him an apology." Denise turned sharply, her face still pale. "I didn't know, Amy. How was I supposed to know who he was?" Amy's expression hardened. That's the point. You didn't know, and you assumed the worst anyway." She shook her head, her voice laced with disappointment. "You judged a man who served this country just because he didn't fit your idea of what's normal." The words hit Denise like a slap, and for a moment she couldn't respond. Her eyes drifted to the table Robert had occupied. His sketchbook lay open, forgotten in the rush to leave. She hesitated, then slowly walked over to pick it up. The page showed a detailed sketch of the ocean, the waves crashing against the pier in perfect fluid lines. But what caught Denise's attention wasn't the skill of the drawing, it was the small inscription at the bottom of the page. "For the peace I seek but can't find." The words sent a pang through her chest. She stared at them, her mind replaying the officer's words. "He saved my life in Kandahar." The weight of what she had done, the insult she had added to a man already carrying so much, pressed down on her. The cafe door chimed again, drawing her attention. Officer Daniels walked back in, his expression unreadable. He approached Denise, his steps deliberate. "You forgot this," he said, holding out Robert's military cap. Denise hesitated, taking the cap from his hands. "Officer, I didn't mean to—" Daniels raised a hand, cutting her off. "What you meant doesn't change what you did, but what you do next might." He glanced at the sketchbook in her hands, then at the cap. Without another word, he turned and left. Denise stood there, holding both items, her mind spinning. Around her, the cafe buzzed with conversation, but she barely heard it. She realized she had a choice, to leave things as they were, or to try to make amends. She exhaled shakily, setting the sketchbook and cap on the counter. For the first time that day, Denise wasn't thinking about protecting her cafe or her image. She was thinking about Robert, the man she had wronged, and the steps she would need to take to make it right. The sun dipped lower into the horizon, casting long shadows over the parking lot as Robert and Officer Daniels walked side by side. They stopped near Daniels' squad car, the hum of the engine blending with the distant sound of crashing waves. "You didn't have to step in like that," Robert said, his voice quiet but firm. His gaze was fixed on the ocean in the distance, the notebook tucked under his arm like a shield. Daniels leaned against the car, crossing his arms. "Yes, I did," he replied, his tone resolute. "What happened in there was wrong, and you know it." Robert sighed, shaking his head. "I'm used to it. People don't know what they don't understand. I can't blame them for that." Daniels frowned, his jaw tightening. "That doesn't make it right. You've been through enough, Rob. You don't deserve to be treated like that." For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken memories. Daniels glanced at Robert, his expression softening. "You never told me you were living around here. How long have you been in town?" Robert shifted his weight, still avoiding eye contact. "About 6 months. Needed somewhere quiet." Daniels studied his old squad mate, noticing the tension in his posture and the lines of exhaustion etched into his face. He didn't press further, sensing that Robert wasn't ready to share more. "You've got people here," Daniels said after a pause. "Me, for one. You don't have to do this alone." Robert finally looked at him, his eyes reflecting a mix of gratitude and reluctance. "I appreciate it," he said simply. Daniels nodded, his lips curling into a faint smile. "You know where to find me." Just as Robert was about to respond, the cafe door opened behind them, and Denise stepped out hesitantly. She held his military cap and sketchbook in her hands, her expression a mix of shame and determination. "Excuse me?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. Robert and Daniels turned to face her, and for a moment Denise faltered under their combined gaze. But then she squared her shoulders, taking a deep breath. "Well, I think you forgot these," she said, holding the items out to Robert. Robert took a step forward, his expression neutral. He reached for the cap and notebook, his fingers brushing against hers briefly. "Thanks," he said, his voice even. Denise hesitated, clutching her apron nervously. I owe you an apology," she began, her words halting. "I judged you without knowing anything about you, and that was wrong. I'm sorry." Daniels watched the exchange silently, his arms still crossed. Robert studied Denise for a moment, then nodded. "Apology accepted," he said simply, though his tone gave little away. Denise's shoulders relaxed slightly, but the weight of her actions still lingered in her eyes. "If there's anything I can do to make it right." Robert tilted his head, considering her offer. "Maybe start by treating the next guy like me a little better," he said, his voice carrying a quiet strength. Denise nodded quickly, her eyes misting over. "I will," she promised. As she turned to head back inside, Daniels clapped a hand on Robert's shoulder. "You handled that better than I would have," he said with a chuckle. Robert smirked faintly, slipping the cap back onto his head. "You always were the hothead," he replied. The two men shared a brief laugh, the tension lifting slightly. But as Daniels got back into his car and Robert turned toward the pier, it was clear to both of them that the moment had been a turning point, not just for Denise, but for Robert too. Robert made his way to the end of the pier, the ocean breeze tugging at his jacket. The rhythmic crash of waves against the wooden posts provided a backdrop to his thoughts, the noise steady and grounding. He ran his fingers over the edges of his sketchbook, now safely back in his hands, and glanced briefly at the cap on his head. It was an odd moment. Gratitude mixed with an unease he couldn't shake. The truth was, moments like the one at the café weren't new to him. Being judged by appearances or treated as a threat had become part of his post-military life. But today had felt different. It wasn't just the assumption that had stung. It was the sudden exposure of his past, laid bare by Daniels in front of strangers. Robert wasn't sure what felt worse, being treated with suspicion or being reduced to the sum of his service and sacrifice. As he leaned against the railing, his thoughts were interrupted by a faint shuffle of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Denise standing a few yards away, hesitant but determined. She had changed out of her café apron, her posture less rigid now. "I hope I'm not bothering you," she said softly, keeping her distance. Robert turned back to the ocean, not answering immediately. "What do you want?" he asked after a moment, his tone neutral. Denise stepped closer, clutching a small paper bag in her hands. "I wanted to bring you this," she said, holding the bag out awkwardly. Robert raised an eyebrow, but didn't take it right away. "You some food," Denise explained, her cheeks flushing. "It's not much. A sandwich and some pastries, left over from today. I thought you might like it." He glanced at the bag, then back at Denise. She looked nervous, unsure if her gesture would be welcomed or rejected. After a moment of hesitation, Robert reached out and took the bag. "Thanks," he said simply, though his voice carried no warmth. Denise nodded, standing there awkwardly. "Look, I know I already apologized, but I just feel terrible about what happened. It wasn't fair to you." Robert sighed, looking down at the bag in his hands. "You can't undo things like that," he said, his voice steady but firm. "What you did, it stays with people, makes them feel like they're not worth anything." Denise's face crumpled slightly, and she looked down at her feet. "I know," she whispered, "and I want to do better, I really do. I've been reading about veterans, about PTSD, and the struggles you all face. I just didn't understand before." Robert glanced at her, surprised by her words. She wasn't just apologizing now, she was trying to learn. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Understanding helps," he said quietly. "It's a start. They stood in silence for a moment, the sound of the waves filling the space between them. Finally, Denise took a step back. "I'll leave you alone," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "But if you ever come back to the café, I promise it'll be different." Robert didn't respond right away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. But as Denise turned to walk away, he called out, "Denise?" She stopped, turning back to face him. "Thanks for the food," he said, his tone softer this time. A small, tentative smile broke across her face. "You're welcome," she replied, before heading back toward the boardwalk. Robert watched her go, the paper bag still in his hands. The sandwich inside wasn't much, but the gesture carried more weight than the meal itself. For the first time that day, he felt a small crack in the wall of bitterness he had built around himself. Maybe change was possible after all. The pier's lights flickered on as twilight settled in, casting a golden glow over the water. Robert leaned against the railing, the paper bag resting beside him. He hadn't opened it yet. Something about Denise's gesture felt heavier than a simple meal. As he stood there, lost in thought, a voice called out behind him, "Robert?" Turning, he saw a young man jogging toward him. It was Kyle, one of the high school kids who often hung out at the boardwalk skate park. Kyle stopped a few feet away, slightly out of breath, clutching a brown envelope in his hand. "Hey, man," Kyle said, smiling awkwardly. "I was looking for you." Robert raised an eyebrow. "Looking for me? What for?" "Hi." Kyle scratched the back of his neck, suddenly sheepish. "Well, some of us, me, my friends, and a few others from around here, we heard about what happened at the cafe today. The officer told a few people about you, about your service." Robert's jaw tightened, his discomfort evident. "Great," he muttered, turning back to the water. "That's just what I need, people talking about me." Kyle hesitated, clearly unsure how to proceed. "Look, I get it, you probably don't want people in your business, but—" He held out the envelope. "We wanted to do something, to say thank you." Robert glanced at the envelope, but didn't take it. "What is it?" Kyle shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "It's not much, just some money we pooled together. You know, for whatever you need. Groceries, art supplies, or, I don't know, coffee?" He chuckled nervously, trying to lighten the mood. Robert stared at the envelope, his expression unreadable. Finally, he reached out and took it, his fingers brushing against the crinkled edges. "You didn't have to do this," he said, his voice low. "I know," Kyle said quickly. "But we wanted to. You deserve more than what happened today." The sincerity in Kyle's voice gave Robert pause. He looked at the young man, seeing not just gratitude but respect in his eyes. It wasn't something Robert had encountered much since leaving the military. "Thanks," Robert said, his voice softer now. "It means more than you know." Kyle grinned, relief washing over him. "Anytime, man. And hey, if you ever want to hang out at the skate park, we're there most afternoons. You can teach us how to draw waves or something." Robert smirked faintly. "I'll think about it." Kyle nodded and turned to leave, but before he walked away, he looked back. "You're a good guy, Robert. Don't let today make you think otherwise." As Kyle disappeared down the boardwalk, Robert stood silently for a moment, the envelope and paper bag in his hands. He opened the bag, pulling out the sandwich. The simple act of unwrapping it felt oddly grounding, a reminder of kindness in a day that had started with rejection. He took a bite, staring out at the water. For the first time in months, he allowed himself a small smile. Maybe things weren't perfect, but moments like these reminded him that not everyone judged him by what they saw on the surface. Robert tucked the envelope into his jacket pocket, finishing his sandwich as the waves rolled in. The pier lights reflected on the water, stretching into the horizon like a path leading somewhere he hadn't yet imagined. The café was quieter than usual the next morning. Denise had arrived early, unable to sleep after the events of the previous day. She moved methodically through her opening routine, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment. Robert's quiet acceptance of her apology lingered in her thoughts, making her stomach twist with guilt. The sketchbook sat on the counter where she'd left it the night before, its worn cover staring back at her like a reminder she couldn't ignore. Denise had flipped through it after closing the cafe, hesitating at first but eventually succumbing to curiosity. The sketches inside were stunning, detailed, emotional, and raw. They told a story without words, one of loss, resilience, and searching for peace. A small bell jingled as the door opened, and Amy walked in carrying a tray of fresh pastries from the bakery down the street. "Morning," she said, her tone cautious as she set the tray down. Denise glanced up, offering a half-hearted smile. "Morning." Amy studied her boss for a moment before speaking. "You okay?" Denise let out a slow breath, wiping her hands on a towel. "Not really. I keep thinking about yesterday, about Robert." Amy nodded, leaning against the counter. Yeah, it was. A lot. She paused, then added, but at least you tried to make it right. That counts for something. Denise shook her head. It doesn't feel like enough. He deserved better from me. From all of us. She gestured to the sketchbook. Did you know he's an artist? His drawings, they're incredible. You can see everything he's been through in them. Amy tilted her head. Really? That's... wow. She hesitated, then asked, what are you going to do? Denise stared at the sketchbook for a long moment before answering. I want to do more than apologize. I want to help. Not just him, but others like him. Amy's eyebrows raised in surprise. You mean veterans? Yes, Denise said firmly. I've been reading about local organizations that support veterans, places where they can get help or even just feel welcome. I want the cafe to be part of that, a place where they know they're respected. Amy smiled, a flicker of hope lighting her face. That's a great idea, Denise. I think Robert would appreciate that. Denise nodded, determination hardening her expression. I hope so, but more than that, I want to make sure no one else walks in here and feels the way he did yesterday. The bell jingled again and Denise turned, half expecting Robert to walk through the door. Instead, it was one of the regulars, an elderly man who always ordered the same cup of black coffee and read the newspaper in the corner. Still, Denise felt a new sense of purpose as she poured his coffee and handed it to him. This was her chance to change things, to make her cafe more than just a business. She couldn't undo the past, but she could choose to act differently moving forward. And maybe, just maybe, the next time Robert walked in, it would feel like a place he belonged. The following week, the Shoreline Cafe was different. Subtle changes had begun to take shape. A small sign on the front door read, Veterans Welcome Here. Inside, a bulletin board had been mounted on the wall near the counter, filled with flyers for local veteran support groups, job fairs, and mental health resources. Denise had spent the past few days researching, making phone calls, and reaching out to organizations she had never even known existed. The transformation wasn't just physical. Denise carried herself differently now. There was a newfound warmth in her interactions with customers, a conscious effort to look beyond appearances and connect with the person in front of her. On a quiet afternoon, as the sun poured through the windows, Robert walked into the cafe. The soft chime of the bell caught Denise's attention, and she looked up from the counter. Her heart skipped a beat, but this time it wasn't out of discomfort. It was determination. She turned to Michael. "Robert," she said, her voice steady but warm, "it's good to see you." Robert glanced around, noticing the changes immediately. His eyes lingered on the bulletin board, the small sign on the door, and the new energy in the cafe. He walked up to the counter, his sketchbook tucked under his arm as always. "I see you've made some changes," he said, his tone neutral but curious. Denise nodded, her hands folded in front of her. "I did. After what happened, I realized I had a lot to learn and a lot to fix." She hesitated, then added, "This place, it's yours as much as it is anyone else's." Robert studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Thank you." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Can I get you a coffee?" "On the house." A small smile tugged at the corner of Robert's lips. "Sure. Black." As she poured the coffee, Amy appeared from the back, her face lighting up when she saw Robert. "Hey, good to see you again," she said cheerfully. Robert nodded at her, then took his coffee to the same corner table he had sat at before. This time there were no sideways glances, no murmurs from the other patrons. Instead, there was a quiet sense of respect in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement of the man who had been wronged and the steps taken to make things right. Denise watched from behind the counter as Robert pulled out his sketchbook and began to draw. She didn't interrupt him, but she felt a small sense of pride knowing he had chosen to come back. A few minutes later, a man in his 40s wearing a navy baseball cap walked in. He noticed the bulletin board immediately and approached Denise. "I saw your sign outside," he said. "It's nice to see a place like this. Mind if I grab a coffee?" "Of course," Denise said with a smile, handing him a menu. The cafe began to fill slowly, with a mix of regulars and newcomers. Some were veterans, drawn by the sign and the bulletin board. Others were locals who had heard about the changes and wanted to show their support. By the end of the day, Denise felt something she hadn't felt in years: purpose. The Shoreline Café had become more than just a business. It was a place of connection, healing, and community. As she closed up for the night, she glanced at the sketch Robert had left behind on the bulletin board. It was a drawing of the café, with its small tables, warm lights, and the ocean in the background. At the bottom, he had written, "Sometimes peace finds you where you least expect it." Denise smiled, locking the door and stepping out into the cool evening air. The café lights glowed behind her, a beacon of hope in the small beachside town.